This is Divorce Court, presided over by Judge William Keene. In the case we'll be seeing today, Stella Dalton is suing Lee Dalton, her husband of 3.5 years, for divorce on the grounds of mental and physical cruelty. Mr. Dalton is countersuing on the same grounds.
All right, Dalton versus Dalton. Mr. Cohen, do you desire to make an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Your Honor, we're asking for a divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. We're further seeking that Mr. Dalton return to my client approximately $80,000 of insurance proceeds that my client received from insurance from the death of her first husband. This is money that Mr. Dalton, to this date, refuses to give back. The issue of custody, Your Honor, is not before this court. My client has a child from a previous marriage. We are seeking 1/2 the marital assets and spousal support, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Finkle, do you want to reserve your opening statement, or do you want to make it now?
I'd like to give it now, Your Honor. Thank you. When they were married, Mrs. Dalton's debts and prolific spending habits caused Mr. Dalton to institute economy measures so they might be able to begin the marriage free of debt. We're going to prove that after Josh was injured, an injury for which she blames Mr. Dalton for, she became physically and mentally abusive to him to the point that he had to seek medical treatment. My client is countersuing for mental cruelty, and he's asking for custody of the son Josh. He also asks that the pawn shop, which he owned prior to the marriage, be kept out of the marital estate. Thank you.
Mr. Cohen, call your first witness, please.
Your Honor, I call Mrs. Dalton to the stand.
Mrs. Dalton, step forward.
Stella Dalton, the plaintiff, is about to be sworn in. She charges that at their marriage, her husband demanded and received all the insurance money she received from the death of her first husband, then denied her access to it, and that he endangered the life of her son, Josh.
All right, Mr. Cohen, let's proceed.
Thank you. Mrs. Dalton, how did you first meet your husband?
Lee had been coaching my son Josh's Carby County Little League team, and all I kept hearing was Lee this and Lee that. So one day after a game, I went over to the dugout and I introduced myself. Josh was right. Lee was really terrific, but... and we started seeing each other, and Josh cheered us on.
How long did you know Mr. Dalton before you married him?
About 6 months. He, Josh, and I did everything together. Well, in a few weeks, it seems like we had always been together. Well, Lee proposed over a pizza, and Josh begged me to say yes. Well, I was unsure about making a commitment at that time, but Lee was very persuasive. He assured me the only thing he wanted in life was to take care of us.
Did Mr. Dalton know of the approximate $100,000 of insurance proceeds you received from the death of your first husband?
Yes, he did. That was to be kept in for Josh's education. His pawnbroker business was to provide for us very handsomely.
When did all of this change, ma'am?
Less than a year after we were married. Lee had me put all my money in a joint account with him. One day, the bank sent a notice saying that there was no money in the account. He used all my life savings.
Despite this, you remained with your husband, is that correct?
Yes, though it took a lot of teeth-gritting effort to keep that marriage together. And Lee, well, Josh loved Lee. If it wasn't for that, I think I would have left him. And then Josh almost died. And I can only hold Lee responsible for that.
Can you explain what you mean by that, ma'am?
Josh loved going down to my husband's pawnbroker shop and the characters that came there. I tried to discourage him from going down there, but Lee insisted that he go down, although he had been beaten and robbed several times himself. Well, one day, when Josh was in there, a man came in and shot Joshua in the stomach. He was hospitalized for months. I nearly lost him several times.
How did Josh's accident affect your marriage?
He blamed me. One day when I was in my son's room at home, I was going through his toys and his clothes, and Lee started yelling at me. He started throwing Josh's things around. Well, he started acting really crazy. And then later, without consulting me, he started to give away Josh's things, his clothes, his furniture, as if he had died.
What finally led you to file for divorce from your husband, Mr. Dalton?
Lee had inherited some small inheritance from some distant relative, and he had to provide a birth certificate to claim it. So I went into his files, and I discovered some statements from banks I didn't recognize. They were all in Lee's name. He had stashed away $80,000, 60 of it, which was deposited on the day he took over our finances. When I consulted him on this, He threw a briefcase at me and said I would never see a penny of that again. Well, I packed my things and I left that day.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Dalton, when you married Lee Dalton, weren't you deeply in debt?
Well, I owe some
Weren't
money,
you spending so much that all of your insurance couldn't take care of the debts?
but I bought only what I needed.
Did you need a brand new sports car?
Well, no, I didn't need one, but at the time...
Your husband took over managing the family finances only after you ran him so deeply into debt he feared losing the business. Isn't that true?
He wanted us to live like paupers. I only spent what we needed to live on comfortably.
Well, I have bills that total $9,000 that you spent in 6 months for women's apparel. I suppose that's what you mean by comfortable. Isn't it a fact, Mrs. Dalton, that the day your son was shot, you sent him to your husband's pawn shop so that you could go on a shopping spree?
Well, yes, but Joshua hated to go shopping with me. He begged me to let him go down there.
Mrs. Dalton, on the day your son was shot, your son came out of the pawn shop back room waving an antique gun, which a robber mistook for a real gun. So wasn't the accident simply a mistimed tragedy?
Lee should have protected him.
And you've punished your husband ever since relentlessly, correct?
No, he punished me.
After your son was hurt, did you move out of your bedroom telling your husband that you'd spend a cold day in hell before you slept with him again?
Yes, and I meant it.
Didn't your husband try for months to counsel with you, to do everything with you, to try to save the marriage?
It was too late. I couldn't love him after he had been so negligent with Josh.
Mrs. Dalton, isn't it your guilt over your negligence that causes you to blame him?
No, I
have
didn't
no
do
further
anything.
questions, Your Honor.
I have nothing to be guilty about.
I have no further questions.
Mrs. Dalton, you may step down. Mr. Cohen, call you next
While
witness.
Stella Dalton leaves the stand, we have time for a short break. We return now to divorce court, being sworn in as Melissa Brock, testifying on behalf of Stella Dalton.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you. Mrs. Brock, how long have you known Mrs. Dalton?
Since college, about 15 years.
Have you been a witness to any violent behavior by Mr. Dalton towards my client after Josh had been shot?
Yes. As a matter of fact, it was at Josh's hospital bed. Stella was so happy, she was crying with relief because the doctor had just told her that her son would make it. Josh was going to be okay. She turned to hug Lee, and he slapped her so hard against the face, saying, "Well, I guess you won't be using that black dress you bought for $1,200. Well, then he just left her, walked out, left her standing there. I had to drive her home. She had no way to get home. We were just speechless the whole time. Couldn't believe the cruelty of that man.
Did Mrs. Dalton buy a black dress for $1,200?
Of course not. Only Lee would say that.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Finkle, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. When Mr. Dalton slapped his wife, isn't it because she had just said, Josh is going to make it, no thanks to you?
I didn't hear anything like that.
Didn't you once call Mr. Dalton a cheap thief?
Oh, well, he is, yes. He stole all of her money and caused her to live like a welfare case.
Did you ever get his side of that story?
I didn't need his side.
I have
Stella's
nothing
side's
further,
good
Your
enough for
Honor.
me.
You may step down. Mr. Cohen, call your next witness, please.
Your Honor, we'll rest at this time.
Mr. Finkle, call your first witness.
Then I'll call Mr. Lee Dalton, Your Honor.
Mr. Dalton, step forward.
Now taking the stand is Lee Dalton, the defendant who's countersuing on grounds of mental and physical cruelty. Mrs. Dalton has accused her husband of taking the insurance settlement from her first husband and hiding it away in various bank accounts. She also blames him for the near death of her son.
All right, let's proceed with the defendant.
Thank you. Mr. Dalton, did you meet your wife in the way she testified?
Yes. At first, I resisted Josh's matchmaking efforts until he pointed her out, and then I begged to be introduced. And then one day, between innings, she came over and introduced herself. There was such a nice sparkle in her eyes and such a friendliness, it was irresistible.
How was your marriage, Mr. Dalton?
We were compatible in every area except in finance. Now, I knew Stella had some insurance money, but it wasn't enough to justify her spending the way she did. I mean, she was buying things like there was no tomorrow, and then she hid the bills. She couldn't even manage a household allowance. We had to eat canned SpaghettiOs because she spent the house money on another pair of shoes that she couldn't live without.
Did you take her money and put it into an account in your name?
Yes, all except $20,000 that I had earmarked for Josh's education, and all the rest and some more went to paying off her debts. And the $60,000 that she was referring to came as a result of selling some land. It was just a coincidence that the transaction happened to be finalized at the same time. I was keeping it aside, hopefully for our old age, before she flushed it away.
When Josh was shot, did your marriage change?
Drastically. I mean, there wasn't a day that went by that she didn't tell me that it was my fault. And that nearly destroyed me. I was hoping that it was me that should have been shot instead. I love Josh, just like my own son.
Well, can you explain why you got rid of his furniture and his possessions?
Josh had complained to Stella because Stella wanted him to keep what he called his kids' furniture. He wanted bunk beds and more grown-up toys, so I bought them for him. It was a welcoming home gift.
Did you and your wife continue to share a bedroom after the accident?
No. No, after the shooting, she wouldn't let me touch her. And then she would have conversations with Josh when he wasn't there. And it scared the hell out of me. I really thought that she was going over the edge. I wanted her to get some professional help, and that's when I got a bill for a session with Mrs. Preston, a psychic.
Who would use Mrs. Preston's services?
Stella. And when I confronted her with it, she said that Mrs. Preston and Josh said that I was fully to blame for Josh's injuries. And to top it all off, she said that Mrs. Preston said that in a previous life, Stella had killed me. And that in this reincarnation, I was going to kill her son to equalize the karma.
Mr. Dalton, do you regret the breakup of your marriage?
With everything, yes. But for the life of me, there was nothing I could do to save it. I mean, Stella was way beyond